have an hour to go, Rohit, about an hour to go for this session. And firstly, thank you to you, Group Captain Bali, and the whole BOA for inviting me. I'm always delighted to be here. Frankly speaking, this is a heated, animated, passionate discussions around here, and I saw some of it during the previous session, and I hope next two sessions are useful for you and the entire panelist as well. So thank you for inviting me. Just a quick housekeeping announcements before we move to the session. One is that we will share CAPA's perspective on general aviation, some of the issues that were raised, and hopefully broad-base this discussion around 3-4 pivots, which will be useful for our panel members given their experience, and possibly for the audience, so that we can come out of this session and fix up a few issues which we can take up with BOA as an industry and other stakeholders. So that's the housekeeping announcements. I'll take about 5 to 7 minutes to explain our perspective on the infrastructure shortages. How do we see it? How can we sort it out? What are the drivers that will bring this change? And who are the stakeholders who need to play a part? Because I guess every stakeholder would need to play a part in this. First of all, when we talk about infrastructure, as of now, it's a $45 billion investment that's required. And this is only for next, potentially, decade and a half. Factors in the scheduled, non-scheduled, and factors in land acquisition prices, and some of it we ignore when we talk about infrastructure, that if we do land acquisition as per the market rates, we will never have an airport in India. So it has to be subsidized. So this projections of $45 billion is also factors in the land at a very acquisition in a subsidized rates provided to the developer. As you would know, when we talk about such a large investment sum, and I will come to the non-scheduled part just now, but on the scheduled part, when we talk about $45 billion, which means roughly about $12 to $15 billion of equity risk capital, and you need about $30 billion of possibly debt raise. If you talk in the current situation in India, raising about $12 to $15 billion of equity capital, which is roughly about billion plus or $1.5 billion every year, given the state of the balance sheets of entire infrastructure companies in India, it's a very difficult challenge. So even for schedule, raising this capital is not going to be easy till we create a possible framework, both on the policy side, which includes the economic regulation and the other regulatory structure. Non-scheduled is a different ball game, and I will address about non-scheduled as well, and I will separate corporate aviation separately to the helicopter operations. So if you have a $45 billion requirement, we are capital starved, infrastructure shortages, and the government is cognizant of it, is putting all the efforts to make the infrastructure shortages, challenges be overcome in a short period of time. But we need to look at it from 3-4 pivots, and I'll explain, hopefully you'll ask. We have 2 people who have invested in infrastructure and one who knows MRO and the related business quite for a long time. That first of all, we need to look at the design part. Is the designing set up for success? Are we set up to succeed from a design perspective? Second, what's our delivery mechanism? Is our delivery mechanism in line so that the outcome of infrastructure and the objectives of infrastructure are addressed? Third, which boils down to almost everything, whether it's a scheduled part or a non-scheduled part, or building helicopter infrastructure, is the cost of infrastructure. And when you talk about the cost of infrastructure, you bring viability in and to attract investors. Viability is central. And as the government moves towards aviation infrastructure more in the private hands, addressing of the viability issue to me is central before we can talk about anything else. So when we talk about viability, and I talked about design first, and this is our perspective, we share these recommendations with the government, and I'm glad that we've done it for 3-4 years now regularly. I like to talk about the design part first, and which is possibly to do with robust planning, implementation, integrated, scalable, economical infrastructure, master plans which address a general aviation industry, address a cargo industry, addresses an express industry, also addresses the scheduled part of the industry. So the design part is critical if we have to succeed. Second is the delivery part, as you would know. We have airports like Bangalore, which opened, we hadn't access to that airport. Frankly, the first 1.5 years was a challenge. Hyderabad was a similar issue. The promoters decided to build a road themselves. At least it became better than Bangalore, but the challenges of implementation was very big. So the delivery mechanism itself needs to be looked at whether we can deliver. And I am, ladies and gentlemen, speaking this from one perspective, which is viability. How can we address the viability issue? So how do we create a delivery mechanisms, which the oversight mechanism, which delivers on time, in line with the project guidelines, ensures that the multimodal integration is there, and more important, it is delivered within the cost that it is envisaged. And we know the airport infrastructure has moved roughly from less than $1 billion when it was first envisaged in 2002. It had moved up to almost one airport had $2 billion, other airport had $2.5 billion. So those timelines have got to do with the design, how we set up to succeed. Second, ultimately, as we said, you will have to possibly look at the whole viability issue. Because I am sure people, whether it's an OEM, whether it's airport operators, or whether it is investors and FBO, if you have not a viable, which addresses, stabilizes the risk profile, you will not get that investment. So from our perspective, there are two critical things. One is, how do you design better? And when you design better, how do you deliver better? So in India, we have a planning commission for planning. But what about having an implementation commission? And we see this as a big issue in the government, that they have a great intent, but execution sometimes you lack because the implementation capability is not there. So these are two central things that could drive investors like GMR, GVK, and other investors to come. There is another point which we heard the Joint Secretary speak, and that's the government's view of spending money and building low-cost airports, building more and more infrastructure across the country. That's a strategic investment, which nothing has got to do with the viability, which is to say that the government says that I need a broad-based infrastructure, which China did many years back before the private capital, or obviously the viability came. So the government may think in this wisdom that I need to broad-base the investment, whether it makes viability sense or not, but it's a strategic priority for the government for various reasons. That investment, possibly we can't debate. But on a viability side, where these guys or any one of you have to put in money, you would need to look at the design, delivery, cost, and ultimately execution of those projects. So when we talk about infrastructure, I'll quickly say, and I want to ask three of them, because I was involved with a couple of the projects that they did. One, on the infrastructure side, if you have to make sure that, sorry if I'm audible, if you have to make sure that it's an outcome-based infrastructure, achieved on time, low cost, in consumer interest, there is one single factor that we miss, is the institutional infrastructure. I would think before building a physical infrastructure, the institutional infrastructure is very important, and I will explain what an institutional infrastructure is. I mean, when I talk about institutional infrastructure, I talk about policy and a well-designed policy, which takes in the inputs on a global best practices, benchmarks, and comes up with a policy structure, and is widely consultative. And I talk about economic policy as well, not only in the strategic policy element. The regulatory structure, which follows a policy structure, which is very important to make it inclusive. For example, airports are having a lot of challenge with economic regulation for 8-10 years. Recently, there was a group of investors who came. They said that the economic regulation is to be more predictable. So how do you make sure that the regulatory framework is better? Skills is an important issue. People who run helicopter and general aviation businesses know that how to get a commander, how difficult it is to get a commander, how difficult it is to even attract pilots to work for you. And it's a second or third or the last choice for most of the CPL license holders. Engineering skill sets, ATC professionals, the whole paradigm which builds the skill infrastructure is in the part of the institutional infrastructure which needs to be addressed. Second and more important, and which is my key point, and I link it to viability itself, is this taxation charges regime, which frankly speaking, I was just discussing, if you have an import of 19% on aircraft. Post GST, there are some taxation issues. Those affect viability. So when you are building an institutional infrastructure, these elements like taxation and charges are aligned to making the projects viable so that the investment can come. Then the whole part is planning itself. Like if you have to build airports now, you need maybe 3 to 4 years to build a national master plan for airports, which is inclusive, which is integrated with regional economies in India, which is integrated with multimodal infrastructure. To build a plan where investment can come would need about 3 to 4. Obviously, I am not factoring in the land part of it. Then the whole critical part is the implementation. It's my belief, with no offense meant to anybody, that we are overburdening Airports Authority of India. I think we will be soon reaching where a situation where becoming a government company, they will have to receive all the inputs that come from government, but whether they should take an UDAN to handle, or they should be building infrastructure, optimizing infrastructure, making sure we sweat our assets much more is an issue. And lastly, in the institutional infrastructure, I talk about ease of doing business. Some of it from the helicopter industry people, and I will hear it from Rohit as well, and some of you, the whole ease of doing business from a policy perspective, getting the archaic rules moved, that's the other part of the institutional infrastructure. Second part, which I said, and which I think it's critical, and I will ask whether it's important or not. Whether are we infrastructure deficit or we are inefficient? There can be only two parts. The recent study that we completed, we shared with the government, I made a presentation to the minister as well, that in the next 3 to 5 years, if we grow at 15%, possibly 20, we've been growing at 20 for 3 years, if we grow another 15, 20% for another 2, 3 years, we will have a shortage of infrastructure across the country. AI airports and most of the other airports, bearing Delhi or Hyderabad or Cochin and Bangalore to some extent. But the entire infrastructure is going to come to a halt. Leave slots, leave parking bays, leave the discussion around BA or general aviation or helicopters. The debate that the airports are going to saturate is a big issue for the government, and I'm sure the government is cognizant of it. So that's one thought, that we may, if we continue to be the level of efficiency that we have, and I'll explain that just now, we may end up spending money and having a second airport in, say, Jaipur and Ahmedabad, whilst as the current airports have a lot of capacity to offer, should you sweat the asset. So if we are having a capacity shortage, which means that we are not willing to improve or become efficient as an industry, it's not a reflection of government or anybody else. So if we are not wanting to improve and sweat our assets, then we will be in 3 years hitting a shortage. Or if we start looking at developing highest level of productivity, and I will explain what it means. I had a discussion with NATS UK recently. I will give you a reference of London City Airport. It's the 4th or 5th smallest airport in UK, in London. 1,500 feet runway, 38 aircraft movements per hour, and they are now relocating the entire ATC tower to a different place and working through a remote location. 38 aircraft movements per hour, wanting to get to 40, 45 on a 1,500 feet runway. That is productivity. Now what we have here, a Delhi airport today has a 2 runway, is producing 65, 70 movements, should be looking at doing 90. Bombay has done exceptionally well. If they do 55, they will do they're currently at 48 to 50. But if they do 55, they will be doing a lot more benefit to all of you and release some slots. Bangalore is doing 34, Hyderabad is in closer to 30, 32. The best practice globally for a single runway is 40 aircraft movements. And that's not for 1 hour. The peaks are rolled over, so you will have 40 for about 15, 20 hours a day. So most of, except the metros, which is, say, closer to benchmark. If I look at AI airports at at Jaipur, for example, it is 12 aircraft movements an hour. Single runway, and I am going to be talking about some issues, how we can improve runway productivity. But the next slot is 8, and then throughout the period of the day, you have 6, 8 aircraft movements. Potentially, if we don't do anything, we will have to build a new Jaipur airport because it's already saturated. Obviously, the terminal capacity is being built. But can we make sure if this doesn't move to 40, let's say it moves to 20, and it rolls over peaks throughout the day, we may create additional capacity of say 6-7 million, which would mean that it gives the government and the whole ministry time to plan well for future infrastructure. So how can we build that efficiency? I'm sure if we build that efficiency to that level in Delhi and Bombay, it is possible that we may release some slots for general aviation, especially in Bombay. More important, for the 5 slots that Delhi has, could move more. But it's not easy, frankly, and I don't know what's the answer, that if one airport in Bombay moves from 25 with a runway occupancy of about 2.5 seconds to moves to 50, 60 seconds now. How do we replicate this throughout the country? Can it be done at Jaipur, that Jaipur moves to 20, 30 for about 13, 14 hours? Ahmedabad moves like this, Bangalore moves to 40. Can we do that? That would mean that we may release 2x, 3x capacity into the system, and that gives everybody the chance to at the same cost. Again, I am referring to viability. This is my central point. And to support that central point, I was making this argument that how do we sweat our assets extremely aggressively before we make. And if we can sweat it to an international benchmark, I am sure some of the BOA customers who are wanting to bring a corporate jet into Bombay may be having few slots. Maybe Delhi can give, not 5, can give 10 slots. The game can slowly, steadily change. And if we couple this with the taxation regime change, charges regime change, certainly you talk about bringing more viability into the sector. Because in Bombay itself, there is 2-3 times the curfew. You can't just get into that airport. So why would somebody buy a plane? Nobody wants to go to Rohini for a helicopter operation. Even Hindon is going to be a difficult challenge. So if we can get Delhi to become extremely efficient, it obviously may release 5 slots. So that's the second critical point. And thirdly is that how do we use technology? There's nothing to say. Why do you need to check in at an airport today? You can do a web check-in, put your bags, can the regulation and policy move towards that? So how can we use technology to make it effective? And even on the surface connectivity side, there is governments in other cities working with the local administration to see that flows get managed to the airport in a much better manner. There's much more better traffic police. They're like, if they have a VIP moment, they know that within 2 minutes the car has to move. Similarly, that kind of an expertise, when they know that people are taking 2 hours to reach the airport, some of it can be addressed as well. So I think, and then the whole about physical infrastructure, which is if you do the institutional part, you sweat your assets properly, make those changes that are required, certainly viability becomes a factor, and viability becomes key, which all of us, including us, them, and people who are in the OEMs, financiers, everybody will be in the game. So today's discussion, frankly, and I want to set this up since we had an hour, I took a more liberty of taking time, that how do we reset the debate? How many times can we talk that we don't have parking bays, we don't have slots, we don't have X, we don't have Y, but we don't address the core, that it's not a viable business. How can you have a helicopter commercial business in a country which doesn't operate below 5,000 kilometers? You can't have a helicopter commercial business. On the top of it, if the noise pollution regulation and environment regulations are more toughened, it took Mr. Ambani a lot of time to get the Mahalakshmi permission for the helicopter, leave alone what a common NSOP operator would get. So how can we move helicopter to a reported airspace which can actually tell the ATC that, listen, I'm going to fly, not be in the designated